everyone. So I'll be telling you about our work on the processing of filler gap dependencies using an interesting case where the search for a gap interacts with another dependency between a fronted reflexive and its antecedent. So we know that filler gap dependency resolution is an active process. Comprehenders don't seem to wait for direct evidence that some position hosts a gap. Instead, we seem to actively predict gaps. So this is evidenced by phenomena like the filled gap effect, where we find evidence for increased difficulty, like slower reading times, in a filled gap position. A potential gap position that is instead filled by an overt argument, like the object of C in which painting did the boy see the girl admiring? And this predictive process is sensitive to grammatical constraints. So in positions that could logically host a gap but do not license a gap grammatically, we do not find evidence for a filled gap effect. For example, because the complement of story in example 2 is an ungrammatical gap position due to the subject island constraint, there's no evidence for a slowdown on the forest, which would indicate reanalysis due to gap prediction in that position. And somewhat like fillers, a cataphoric pronoun also triggers an active search for its antecedent. So she, in when she was at the party, seems to trigger an active search for a feminine noun phrase. And this is evidenced by, again, measures of increased difficulty when a potential antecedent, like the matrix subject in example 3, actually mismatches the cataphor's features. So we slow down on the boy after reading when she was at the party. And this search is also grammatically constrained. So we only slow down on a mismatching noun phrase if it's in a position that can actually host an antecedent for the pronoun that we read. So since her in 4 should not be bound by the matrix subject, there is no slowdown on a mismatching noun phrase, like Christopher. And in this study, we ask what happens when these two searches are triggered simultaneously. So in sentences headed by what we call a reflexive filler, like which picture of herself, comprehenders are cued to predict both a gap for the filler and an antecedent for the fronted reflexive pronoun. And we saw that each search has its own grammatical constraints, but what makes this tricky is that the reflexive must be bound in the gap position. This means that, at least grammatically, these two dependencies are not independent. So the reflexive's antecedent must be higher than the gap in order for the reflexive to be bound in the gap position. So how do readers approach this problem? Are we able to form some global, grammatically informed prediction which satisfies the requirements of both the fronted reflexive and the filler? Or are these two searches independent? And if so, do we need to prioritize one over the other in case of competition? And if so, how do we do that? So we test in Hebrew sentences like 1 and 2. In both cases, the object of C is filled by an overt argument, allowing us to probe for a filled gap effect in that position. And crucially, we manipulate whether the matrix subject, which comes before this filled gap position, serves as an antecedent for the fronted reflexive. So in 1, which picture of herself did the boy see the girl admiring? The subject is masculine, and so there's no antecedent for herself before we get to the filled gap position, to the girl. But in 2, which picture of herself did the lady see the girl admiring? The reflexive antecedent dependency is resolved before we get to the filled gap position. And our predictions are as follows. So first, on the subject, the boy versus the lady, we predict a slowdown when it mismatches the reflexive's features, like in 1 compared to 2. And such a mismatch effect would be indicative of an active search for an antecedent. So after seeing herself, comprehenders would initiate a search for a feminine noun phrase and would be surprised to find a masculine mismatching subject. And at the object-filled gap position, first, either way, 2 should display a filled gap effect on the girl. So readers are likely to predict a gap in the object of C in 2, and there is nothing that should constrain this prediction. And then with regards to the difference between 1 and 2, we compare 2 possible predictions. First, we might only find a filled gap effect in 2, but not in 1. And this would indicate that after encountering a mismatching subject, like the boy, the parser continues to search for an antecedent for the fronted reflexive and prioritizes this search over gap prediction. So in 1, it should not predict a gap in the object of C, and no difficulty should arise when encountering the girl. In fact, in this condition, the parser might be predicting the girl because the girl serves as an antecedent to the reflexive. And this pattern is also compatible with the parser that's able to form a global, grammatically informed prediction that takes into account the requirements of both the reflexive and the filler. Something like, I only predict a gap if it follows an antecedent so that it could facilitate the interpretation of the reflexive. But either way, this pattern would suggest that gap prediction only follows finding an antecedent. But on the other hand, if we find evidence for a filled gap effect in both 1 and 2, this would suggest that the parser prioritizes the filler gap dependency, ignoring the requirement for an antecedent. A filled gap effect in 1 with the mismatching subject would suggest that gap prediction isn't sensitive to the global grammaticality of the sentence because a gap in the object of C would leave the reflexive unbound. And we test these predictions in a series of reading times experiments in Hebrew. Experiments 1 and 2 used identical materials, and we manipulated 2 factors. The first is the gender feature of the subject, in this example, detective, such that it either matched or mismatched the fronted reflexive, and the gender itself was counterbalanced across sets. And the second manipulation was the type of structure. So we compared sentences headed by a reflexive filler to baseline sentences that were headed by an adjunct WH phrase, where we shouldn't see a subject mismatch effect or a filled gap effect. I'll mention that these example materials are simplified, so there were a couple more modifiers in the original Hebrew. Experiments 1 and 2 were identical, except that 1 used a self-paced reading task and 2 used a maze task, a G-maze task. Both were administered online and each to 60 Hebrew speakers. First, the maze task. So the maze task is a method for measuring reading times that essentially increases localization, but at the expense of the naturalness of stimuli presentation. So in the maze task, participants are repeatedly presented with a choice between a correct word that continues the given sentence and a foil which does not. And they read the sentence by, at each point, selecting the correct choice, allowing them to move on to the next word. And our foil words were ungrammatical, given the sentential context. So this was a G-maze task. And for the most part, the foils were just hand-generated. In the third experiment, we also used some foils generated based on a large language model, which then we judged for ungrammaticality. And I think this is the first implementation of the maze task in Hebrew. Okay, so these are the word-by-word reading times in experiments 1 and 2. And you can already see that one looks cooler than the other. And we will be focusing on reading times in the subject and object-filled gap positions. They have a gray background in these plots. So let's zoom in, starting with experiment 1, the self-paced reading. This plot shows the difference in reading times between the critical condition, reflexive filler, and the baseline, comparing match and mismatch conditions on the x-axis. So first, in the subject position, we found evidence for an interaction between structure and agreement, which is suggestive of a reflexive antecedent mismatch effect. So after reading a reflexive filler, it seems that readers slow down when they find a subject that mismatches that reflexive in features. in gender. And second, looking at the object filled gap position, in this experiment, we were not able to detect a filled gap effect at all. So regardless of the agreement manipulation, there was no reliable evidence for a slowdown on the object in the reflexive filler condition. But things look better in the maze. So first, we replicated the subject mismatch effect, and it's larger and more localized. And second, this time, we were able to find a reliable filled gap effect. This is evidenced by the positive difference between the critical and baseline conditions in the object position RTs. And moreover, we found an interaction between structure and agreement in the object position, indicating that the filled gap effect was smaller in the mismatch condition, where given the subject's features, no antecedent for the reflexive precedes the predicted gap. Before we move on to the interpretation of the results, a note on the difference between the tasks. So we can see that what came out as nice big effects in the maze were either smaller or non-existent in the self-paced reading experiment. And in particular, we were pretty surprised not to find a filled gap effect at all in the self-paced reading experiment, despite this being so robust and well replicated, including in Hebrew, right? And this is something we predict regardless of the reflexive being there. And our takeaway from this is that both, as we know, the way reading is set up in the maze forces highly incremental processing because you can't move on to the next word before fully integrating the input into the context. But the other side of this, we think, is that reading in self-paced reading is quite passive, more passive than in real life, where you have some motivation to interpret the text in front of you. And because the task is passive, it may produce inattentive readers. One hint for this from our tasks is that participants' accuracy and the comprehension questions that followed reading, which were the same across the self-paced reading and the maze, was much higher in the maze task. Okay. So focusing on the results of the maze, where we were able to detect a filled gap effect, we have evidence that the filled gap effect is smaller after a mismatch, like in the example at the bottom of the slide. And this is indication that gap prediction is at least somewhat sensitive to the requirements of the reflexive filler, leading to a weaker gap prediction where the reflexive will not be bound. However, the fact that the filled gap effect persisted in this configuration is indication that this sensitivity does not fully block gap prediction. So we still seem to prioritize the filler gap dependency, even if our prediction doesn't align with the requirements of the fronted reflexive. One interpretation of this filled gap effect, despite ungrammaticality, is that it's a result of some sort of noisy channel solution to the oddness of the sentence. So basically, maybe readers would not have predicted a gap unless they found an antecedent, but in these cases, they assumed that there must have been a mistake. For example, that the reflexive was actually supposed to be feminine, matching the subject. And this correction of the input then puts them in a position to predict an object gap normally, resulting in a filled gap effect later down the line. So to test this prediction and to replicate our result, we conducted experiment 3. It was identical to experiment 2 with the addition of a third level to the agreement manipulation, 2 mismatch, where the subject mismatches the reflexive in both gender and number. And in the 2 mismatch condition, a noisy channel type correction is less likely because the number of letters or features that one would need to assume were written incorrectly and to modify is larger. So if the reason for a filled gap effect persisting in the mismatch conditions is this type of correction of the input, we should see even less evidence for it in the 2 mismatch condition. But on the other hand, if the persistent filled gap effect truly reflects a preference for resolving the filler gap dependency despite the lack of an antecedent, there shouldn't be much of a difference between mismatch and 2 mismatch. And like before, the sentences were compared against baseline conditions, which should display neither of the effects. Okay, so this was again a GMAIS task. It was run online. We had 36 items and 90 Hebrew speakers. And first, we replicated the mismatch effect on the subject. So after reading a fronted reflexive, participants slowed down on a feature mismatching subject. And this is evident in the positive difference plotted for the mismatch and the two mismatch conditions. And you can see that the slowdown is slightly larger in the mismatch case compared to the two mismatch case. I'm not sure if there's a meaningful reason for this. It did come out as reliable, but it seems to stem mostly from slower reading of the baseline in the two mismatch condition, weakening the contrast. And I can show you the word-by-word reading time later. And second, looking at the object filled gap position, we replicated the modulation of the filled gap effect, where the match condition had the biggest filled gap effect, and both the mismatch and two mismatch conditions had a smaller filled gap effect. And interestingly, we do not find evidence that the filled gap effect is smaller in the two mismatch condition, so it's pretty much the same size across the mismatch and two mismatch configurations. And we also ran a Bayes factor to check this, and it came out overwhelmingly in favor of a model that collapses the distinction between mismatch and two mismatch for the object position. Okay, so these results speak against the noisy channel-based hypothesis. It seems that participants are as eager to find an object gap and then experience a filled gap effect, even when we make a noisy channel type correction less likely by increasing the degree of mismatch between the reflexive and the subject. So where does this leave us? We contrasted these two predictions. Either the parser prioritizes antecedent search, and then we should see a filled gap effect only after an antecedent was identified in the match conditions, or the parser prioritizes the filler gap dependency and should predict a gap regardless of whether that gap would facilitate the interpretation of the reflexive. And this would produce a filled gap effect in both the match and the mismatch conditions. But the pattern of reading times that we observe is somewhere in between these two predictions. So it seems that overall, gap prediction is prioritized because we find a robust filled gap effect in a position that would not license the reflexive. However, the filled gap effect is smaller after a mismatch, suggesting that our predictions are sensitive to the reflexive's requirements, at least to some degree. One thing that we want to keep thinking about is why this is different than the pattern of reading times in islands. So why did we only find a modulation to the filled gap effect, suggesting sensitivity to a grammatical constraint, but in islands, readers are evidenced to fully block gap prediction, so there's no filled gap effect at all. It may be important here that in the case of islands, there is only one dependency that we're trying to resolve, and the island constraint applies directly to this dependency. So the gap itself is ungrammatical inside an island. But in our reflexive filler sentences, the gap itself is grammatical in the object position, and this position is otherwise very likely to host a gap. It's the search for an antecedent, which might be totally independent, that is not satisfied if we predict an object gap. And we're hoping that this is something that we can keep thinking about by looking at other cases where readers are tasked with two simultaneous searches, if there are others. So maybe the reason for the persistent gap prediction is that readers lack the resources to remain fully sensitive to both the reflexive and the filler at the same time. So to conclude, we replicated the cataphor mismatch effect, this time following a fronted reflexive. We also found that the filled gap effect is sensitive to the search for an antecedent, but not fully, so it still seems to override it. And lastly, we report a contrast between self-paced reading and the maze, which could contribute to the conversation about how different tasks affect our processing heuristics and thus researchers' abilities to detect effects. Thank you for listening.
Ellen Lau, University of Maryland. Super interesting data, but I was just wondering about how you're estimating the field gap effect. And maybe I'm missing how you're doing the baseline, but just looking at the sentences, so it looks like you're always comparing the, so the one sentence is something like, which video of himself the detective filmed the suspect? And then you're comparing the reading time of that, the suspect, to when the detective filmed the suspect? Is that?
It's which video of himself the detective filmed the suspect and when the detective filmed the suspect. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm just wondering, like, I don't know what the solution to this would be, but it seems like the one sentence is clearly more complex.
Absolutely.
Right? So here we're estimating the field gap effect as being just how much longer it is to read that, the suspect NP, with those two contexts prior. And so I'm just wondering if we may be overestimating the field gap effect itself compared to just like other things, like I'm trying to figure out how the himself. And so I'm wondering, when you say that you're finding that the field gap effect is only modulated, if that's, if the way you're estimating the field gap effect is actually adding in other things, it could be that when we were able to attribute the variance to that other factor, it might be that your manipulation is actually covering more of the field gap effect than we're seeing here.
Yeah, thank you for this comment. So we're trying to think about this. I think a straightforward way to test this, and something I want to do, is to add a regular field gap effect sentence, like just which picture did the detective film the suspect deleting?
Yeah, exactly.
And then we can see whether it really is the case that in the mismatch cases you have a smaller one, or maybe what's happening in the match case is that you have a larger one. One reason I could see that happening is that in the match case, so you read which picture of herself did the lady see the girl. When you get to the girl, you have a filled gap effect, and also maybe you have more uncertainty about the interpretation of herself. So that might also contribute to the longer reading times there. Exactly. Yeah, definitely. I think just adding condition without a reflexive would be helpful here. Thanks.
Hello, I'm James Zinn from Mississippi State University. I was just curious, because there are multiple ways to do like a self-paced reading kind of paradigm. Did you do kind of just a single word-by-word presentation?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this was a moving window. It was single, word by word. In Hebrew, words are slightly like determiners, prepositions, complementizers are attached to the lexical material. And I think one other thing that we presented together was of himself, I think. We didn't do it of and then himself.
Thank you. One thing that I was just thinking of was kind of getting at an explanation you had for the SPR versus the grammatical maze thing, where because this seems like very much in the realm of prediction, maybe it is not only the fact that it encourages a more of like passive reading, but also kind of the opposite, where the grammatical maze has you focusing on this integration, and because you're integrating these things together, necessarily you're also going to be predicting the upcoming content so that you'll be able to integrate your choices together faster in the future. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that maybe in addition to the SPR encouraging a more passive representation, then this grammatical maze paradigm may also be encouraging more of this prediction occurring, and that might be also why you get a stronger effect here, which isn't necessarily like a bad thing, but it might also contribute to this.
Yeah, thank you for this comment. I agree with you. I think everything in the maze is just like sort of higher stakes. It's harder. You need to understand everything better in order to move on. You want to succeed, because if you don't succeed, you get this like red text saying that you failed. Yeah, I agree with you. Thank you.
Daphna Heller, University of Toronto. So I have a small question about the difference between the mismatch and the two mismatch, because if I got your examples right, then on paper, the difference is between whether it's just gender or gender and number. But if we think about the Hebrew words, then that is always going to translate into a difference in one letter.
Yeah. Thank you.
And so I wonder.
Yes. It's true that okay, so first of all, we think that probably what you're doing, if you're doing something like this, is you're probably correcting the reflexive and not the subject, because the subject agrees with the verb and there's too much like content there that you would need to fix. So you're probably trying to correct the reflexive, and yeah, in both cases, it would just be one letter that you're changing. So that's true, it's just one letter. But a reason to think that it would happen less in the two mismatch case is that it's two features, and maybe if we sort of extend the noisy channel logic to apply to something like features, then that might predict this difference. And also the plural form is, we haven't checked in a corpus, but it's much less frequent than the singular form, so that would again be something that biases you against this type of misinterpretation in the two mismatch case. But I agree with you that it's just one letter. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, this will be quick. Jack Dempsey, University of Illinois in Cascade Reading. I just wanted to follow up on the previous comment about SPR versus the maze task. And I just wanted to champion that passive reading is also reading. And also, just point out that I think one of your most interesting findings is that humans, depending on the task, deploy different strategies to interpret text, right? I didn't know if you wanted to say more about that, but I think that, for eliciting these specific kinds of effects, you might want to use a maze task, right? Because you need to implement that incremental processing. But it's just as interesting that if you don't do that, the strategies are different, right?
Yeah, I agree with you. Thank you. I think also the difference in the comprehension questions is really interesting there. Like it's really low accuracy in the self-paced reading. I guess one way to think about what the self-paced reading and the maze do with respect to like real world reading is that I think in self-paced reading, as I said, there's very little motivation to actually understand the text in front of you. You're just given a random sentence about a detective and a suspect. No one's trying to communicate any information to you. There's no reason for you to understand this other than the comprehension question. I think that's more passive than in real life, where you like get a text from your mom or read a journal article and you want to understand what someone is telling you, at least for the most part. And in the maze, I agree. It's like so much more incremental, forces so much more foresight and like full integration, because there's no other way to move forward. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Just a very quick question about the Hebrew. So in English, there are a few additional ways out.
Yeah.
Like you could, because the reflexive isn't subject-oriented, you could have the object as the antecedent, or you could add a with. So are those extra ways out blocked off in Hebrew?
So which way out are you thinking
So
about?
one is you could, in English, you could have the object be the antecedent of an indirect object, or you could have a preposition, a with modifier. So there's various ways in which you could rescue yourself without adding an extra clause.
Yeah.
Are those closed off in Hebrew?
Yeah, so I've been trying to think about this. So yeah, so you're thinking of cases where, I don't know what people's judgments are about this, but if I say something like, which picture of himself delighted John, maybe some people would think that's okay? Or were you thinking?
Well, I mean, in English, which video of himself did the detective film the boy with? Or
Which video of himself did the detective film?
film the boy with?
Yeah.
I mean, that's probably not available in Hebrew. But there's other ones where you could have a ditransitive construction, so it was only when you get to the verb that you know that you're dead.
Which video of himself did the detective film the boy? I guess you could continue that. After you get to the filled gap position, you could continue it with a preposition. It's kind of odd. Like, I don't think the sentences that we created, like their semantic content really allows for that. Why are you thinking that that's like an easier way out, given the filled gap?
I'm wondering if these additional possibilities
Yeah.
mean that it's a more complicated set of choices that the reader is facing.
Yeah. I would have to think about that. Thank you. I mean, intuitively, I think, like, okay, what meaning does that really have? Like, which video of himself did the detective film the suspect with? Yeah, I would have to look at my material and like see for each one of them what it is. They're all like with video or picture or something like that, and then you have this verb that is ambiguous between just taking a complement noun phrase and this like little small clause. And I would have to see if it also has the possibility of being a noun phrase and a PP, and if so, is that possible given the lexical material? But thank you, I'll have to think about that.
Thank you, and let's thank Mandy again.